Welcome to the God Conclusion. I'm your host, John Leonard. Good afternoon, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the God Conclusion. Once again, we have Richard Suttles, the Faithiest Atheist. And today we are going to talk about my book, The God Conclusion, the reason that this channel exists and the reason the Facebook page exists. So, Richard, or Faithiest Atheist, what was your overall impression of the book?
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, you and I have done a couple of these shows, and you sent me an audio version of your book. I walk my dog in the mornings and at night, and I listened to it while I was walking the dog, probably over the course of a month, mostly because you bring up a lot of different topics. So I would stop and either think about what I thought about that or research some things. And I had read The God Delusion from Richard Dawkins.
That helps.
Yeah. And I was an atheist when I read it, and I thought maybe similar to what you thought, was that it wasn't really a biological book. It was more his take. It was him bringing in his biology to his views. So I thought it was less of a scientific book more than it was his views as a biologist. So there was some things about it that I liked and didn't like. And so your book was a good follow-up to that, to see how you viewed that and how that inspired you to build your own ministry.
Well, how convinced were you by Dawkins, and how much did I do to change your mind?
I've never been the same kind of atheist that Richard Dawkins is, or maybe I should say it's been 30 years since I've been that kind of atheist. By the time I had read that, I was more like the kind of atheist I am now. So I wasn't really convinced by it, although I understand it. Like, I understand him. I understand how he got to think of the way he is. By the time I read it, I already had some problems with how he is. And so when I got to your book, I could just, and you and I had interacted a few times already, and then I'd been on your show twice. I knew where you were coming from anyway. So in that respect, it wasn't so much surprising as it just added more details to how you see things.
Well, what I say about my book is that I try to put the Bible aside and put Christianity aside and look at scientific evidence and use logic to put forward my argument that God exists. And one of the foundational questions that I ask in the book is, when it comes to the universe and life and everything, we can come up with a binary way of looking at it. That we can say that the universe was either planned or it was unplanned. Do you
Right.
agree or disagree with that?
I would say that, yeah, it was either planned specifically or not. And maybe within the unplanned realm, maybe there's some parameters and limits that would allow for some sort of complexity, temporary complexity, but still not with some agency knowing what's exactly going to happen. So with that caveat, I agree.
All right, so we start off on a good note there. We come to an agreement that the universe was either planned or unplanned. We are not agreeing that it was planned, and we are not agreeing that it was unplanned. We are
Right.
saying that those are the two options.
Right.
All right. So then in my book, I tried to put forward the scientific evidence, what I call the existential scientific evidence for the existence of God. And that's the evidence in favor of the Big Bang, the fine tuning evidence, and the statistical probability calculations of Sir Roger Penrose based on the work of Sir Martin Rees. And that all seems to be rather well accepted scientific evidence that there are new questions that are coming up. And when I got into a long discussion with Aaron Ra, he started trying to argue that the Big Bang never happened. What I think he was actually trying to say was that the mathematics gets really wonky as you go back to the time that is commonly known as t=0, which is
Right.
the actual instant that the Big Bang occurred. And
My take is that the math gets really wonky. Our understanding of math and logic break down. It doesn't mean that math and logic doesn't exist. It just looks like there's something else or there's more to it that we can't grasp yet at that point.
well, but even I think it is fairly well accepted consensus scientific opinion, which I say that with the caveat that consensus is not science and science is not done by consensus. It can be a consensus of everybody being wrong, but the general accepted belief about the origin of the universe was that there was a time before which there was no galaxies, no stars, no planets, not even a single atom. And right. That instance is known as t=0 commonly. Yes. But it doesn't mean that there were stars and planets and galaxies, just because when the math gets difficult to manage as you approach that, I don't know what you call it, that anomaly, that whatever happened, there was a time where there were no stars, planets, galaxies, or atoms.
No matter, no energy, and maybe not even some of those physical laws.
We're making some progress. We're agreeing, which I've had some other guests that tend to have very inflated opinions of themselves, but when it came to fundamental science, they were challenging the basic understood realities in regard to the Big Bang.
And you're right. There's atheists who, for 10 years, would say there was nothing. They would say the words, there was nothing. And then all of a sudden, there was energy, and some of which became matter, and something came from nothing. There was atheists that would say those words. I think that there was, I don't know, and then there was something. But there was certainly atheists who were saying there was nothing, and then there was something. And so it'd be weird for atheists to act like that was new language. It was.
Well, when you say I don't know, are you saying that we can't know, or that the general consensus is wrong?
Well, no, I always think sometimes I think the consensus is usually based on what we have available. So if I say I don't know, I'm not dooming us to never knowing. I'm just saying that right now we can't show it, which is fine. I embrace that. And if there is ever more data, then that would be great. I think atheists and theist scientists should be struggling and agonizing every day to try and see if there's a way to find out more. Like for instance, there was a scientist who said we would never know the molecules and the chemistry of distant stars. He was like, there's so many different ways to make a star, and there's no way we can look at a star and see what it's made of because it's too far away. He was like, and we might as well just give that up. He had no idea that we could eventually pick up signatures of chemicals in light waves and be able to tell exactly what a star is made of. He had no idea, but he did say for sure that we could never, ever get there. Here we are. Now it's taught in third grade. You never know what's coming. And so I think we could potentially end up learning a lot more. We might even learn that the Big Bang was more complex than nothing to something. And actually, if that were to happen, I don't think theism would budge. I don't think a single theist would change his mind. It would change some of the narratives. It would change some of the apologetics narratives, but it would probably be something more like fine tuning than it is a creation from nothing. It would say it's still so amazing that this other stuff was happening, which then transitioned into matter and energy and physical laws. That would have to be a foundation for this fine tuning to eventually happen. So theism won't budge. If Big Bang gets changed into something else with more data, theism won't budge. Just some of the arguments will change. That's all.
Well, I don't know that it's important to call the event, the singularity, the Big Bang. The important thing is to acknowledge that this universe, as we commonly know and love it,
Yeah.
it had a beginning. And the alternative, historically speaking, was the steady state or the eternal universe,
Right.
which was not changing. But the evidence for the Big Bang, which was redshift and cosmic microwave background and radiation,
Mm-hmm.
those discoveries,
Yeah.
those discoveries allowed the Big Bang to go from being a hypothesis to a theory. It's ironic because it was a Catholic priest, Georges Lamont, that came up with the idea of the Big Bang, but he was careful to warn the church to say you can't use this as evidence for God. It implies God's existence, but it's not a smoking gun. There is the possibility that random chance produced the universe. There has to be what anybody that's going to be rational has to say there can't just be only one alternative explanation for anything. There's got to be at least two or more explanations
Right.
potential.
A lot of those original people who would start the field of cosmology and astrophysics, they were religious people. People staring in a telescope were often priests or studying under priests. Yeah, that's always important to point out.
Well, and it's funny because I had never heard of the Big Bang prior to going off to college. And I had come up with the traditional young Earth creationist, the Earth is only 10,000 years old mentality. And a professor in my freshman year talked about the Big Bang and that the universe was billions of years old. Even then, going from being a relatively apathetic young earth creationist to a strong agnostic, borderline atheist there for my college years and beyond. Even then, I knew I had the presence of mind to ask him the question, well, you say that the universe was created from nothing, that the matter just exploded and began expanding out at this incredible speed. Where did the original matter come from? Where did the materials that became matter come from? And it's a very difficult philosophical question because the concept of nothing is very difficult to comprehend.
Nobody can actually comprehend nothing. If like I'll say we don't even know what nothing is like, and they'll say, well, sure, no matter, no energy, no physical laws, and I'm like, that doesn't.
When I do my hands like that and you say there's nothing in my hands,
Right.
between there are air molecules in between my fingers. So you can't say that there is nothing there. Nothing is, like I said, it's a concept where space and matter and time, none of those elements exist.
That's just unfathomable to us. It's interesting. Whenever we try to talk about this, it's hard to visualize.
And again, I don't have all the answers. I have lots and lots of questions.
But
But
I think that's
I look at the scientific evidence, and the scientists are saying that the probability that the Big Bang occurred, and these aren't just numbers that are being pulled out of the air, these are numbers that they spent many hours deriving calculations on the six cosmological factors that are commonly known, the six numbers that affect the construction of the entire universe. And those numbers were estimated to be 1 in 10 to the 300th power. And those are numbers that right off the bat you say that's a silly number, because I think 1 in 10 to the 80th power is the number of every atom in this universe or
right.
something like that. It's a number that is our most difficult to imagine ideas are dwarfed by the idea of 1 in 10 to the 300th power.
Right. Yeah.
But in the unplanned universe, that's the probability that I have to assign, because that's what the scientists have told me that the probability of the unplanned universe is.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then again, I just want to say a lot of atheists were using either numbers like that. They would say and it was so astronomically unlikely. And they're inspiring awe and wonder, and they're like, we're really lucky that all this have happened. And they're not pushing for a creator; they're just saying this was extremely unlikely, and we're lucky that it did happen. A lot of atheists, if they're pushing back on those numbers, they can find recordings of other atheists using similar numbers. The one that comes to mind right now is a guy named Arvin Ash on YouTube, and I forget the title of the video, but he goes into some of these numbers that other scientists came up with and how they came up with them, and
the people that came up with the numbers, Sir Martin Rees and Sir Roger Penrose, they're both atheists.
Right.
It's not like these are theists that are fudging the numbers to make it look more probable that God is the explanation.
Yep.
It's the experts in the field who are taking an unbiased look at the evidence, and they're coming to that conclusion.
Yep, I agree.
Then, immediately after the Big Bang, but there's enough data to classify it as a second anomaly or second singularity, is cosmic inflation. It's that period, that very brief period where the universe expanded at a rate that far exceeds the current rate today. And the numbers that were calculated for that, once again, by atheists, not by theists, Roger Penrose said it was 1 in 10 to the 124th power. I don't even know how to write that as a number.
Right. Yeah.
Once you go 1 in 10 to the 300th power, I think that's 1 or 300 zeros followed by a 1 or something like that. Decimal point and 300 zeros followed by a 1. But when you go 1 in 10, then again, it's absurdities. These aren't numbers that anybody in their right mind would go to Vegas saying, I'm going to be on a hot streak if I just get 1 in 10 to the 124th power of drawing a royal straight flush. The statistical odds, and what I've discovered is people like Roger Penrose, because he's an atheist and he's committed to atheism, he says a lot of very interesting things. One thing that he's done is he's come up with this theory that's cosmic cyclical, conforming cyclical cosmology or something like that. It's 3 C's that goes together. And that's his alternative to the Big Bang. And the idea is that the universe has always existed, and it does like an accordion.
Right.
And it expands and collapses. And then just in this most recent expansion, we've had our universe. Right. And to me, I call those arguments, that's kicking the can down the road, where you're trying to avoid the idea that matter had some sort of an origin. But the evidence seems overwhelming that matter had an origin, that at least if whatever was pre-matter and existed in the multiverse or wherever it existed prior to being in this universe, it wasn't in this universe, and this universe was not a thing. It began 14.77 billion years ago.
There was definitely a transition from I have no idea to matter, energy, physically laws. And maybe that transition was from nothing to that, or some other realm or series of components or something like components with something like time into what we know now. And that stuff didn't exist, and then that stuff did exist. For me, that's the beginning. It doesn't show that it was a blank state and a blank slate and then a creator magically made it. It just shows that there was not that, and then there was that.
Okay.
It's still amazing, still spectacular.
Well, I've got an idea. Recently, there was an episode of Joe Rogan where he was talking with Stephen Meyer.
Yeah, I just did a show about that with Than Christopoulos and Braxton Hunter. We just did a show on that on Than's channel, Exploring Reality.
Boy, you do get around, don't you? Right. But anyway, so you already know what was said, basically. But
yeah, that was a great story.
For the benefit of our audience, I'll recap briefly.
Okay.
The idea was that
this book.
Oh yeah, he's excellent. Yeah. But science says that all the math and all the numbers can all work out if you just give us one miracle. The Terence McKenna quote.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that was a joke.
Yeah.
But that gave me the idea for writing another book, another nonfiction book.
Yeah.
3 miracles. Because it's not just the one miracle, the Big Bang, which I'm not saying that you personally, but Aaron Ra did it. And it seems to be the common atheist tactic to say, well, we don't know what happened prior to the Big Bang. And so we can't say that the Big Bang was necessarily what we currently think it was.
And I just want to just to add in there, I mentioned this before, that even if we do disprove Big Bang, nothing changes, zero changes. Stephen Meyer would have to come on and say, okay, well, my approach there wasn't correct, but it's still amazing. It's still absolutely miraculous that this other stuff was happening. And then the introduction of matter and energy. So not only do I say, I don't know, I also say that even if we do completely disprove it, theism budges, Christianity budges zero. In fact, it'll be even more stronger evidence for fine tuning.
Well, but see, here I'm trying to push the needle in one direction.
Right.
And I said, and what I was going to say is that I've got an idea for another book. It's not one miracle, it's 3 miracles, because there's the origin of the universe itself.
Yeah.
There's cosmic inflation.
Right.
And then there's the origin of life.
Yep.
We know that there was a time where no living thing existed because there was no earth. And so there could not be anything that existed.
There wasn't even rock. If you want to say that there's living organisms or pre-living organisms on asteroids, there wasn't asteroids yet. So you're right. In fact, there was a time when the cosmos was mostly plasma. So and in the plasma time, the electrons couldn't even huddle up with the protons and the neutrons. So you didn't even have atoms for a long time.
So we are in agreement once again, tentatively perhaps, but we are in agreement that there was a time before which no life existed.
Right.
So my argument there is that we need not 1, not 2, but 3 unique miracles for us to exist. That's the Big Bang, cosmic inflation, and abiogenesis.
I would say 4. I would say 4 because consciousness. I think consciousness is a miracle.
See, this is why I wonder which team you're really on, because you make great arguments that help my cause. Yeah. And you're right. You're absolutely right, because the idea of intelligence, that you and I are able to use tools and communicate electronically from thousands of miles away from each other, right, in real time, and communicate intelligent ideas to each other, or at least quasi-intelligent ideas, perhaps coming from me. But we're able to express ourselves in language and once again communicate ideas clearly across this electronic divide, and that requires a significant amount of intelligence. But if the universe was created by a series of random, very fortunate, fortuitous accidents that just happen to all align, or lucky stars, so that you and I are both here and able to have this conversation, there is no rational explanation for the existence of intelligence, for consciousness.
I would add that I would change your book to 4 things, because it's a huge mystery.
I am going to take you up on that advice, and I'm probably going to be getting to work on that book pretty soon, because I just finished the Atheist Prayer manuscript and getting my manuscript appraisal back and going through the editing process. But it's going to be a book before the end of the year, which is very exciting for me. It's a novel, and it's detective murder mystery kind of thing, but I do weave. I think we talked about this before.
Yeah. You didn't get completely into the plot, but you did tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah. So we've only so far talked about the existential scientific evidence
Right.
for God. And before we go any further, I do want to ask you, if you take aside, if you just say God isn't even involved in this equation, we're just talking about whether or not there's some form of supernatural intelligence that is responsible for the universe, which would resolve all of those improbabilities by making them not highly unlikely scenarios, but virtually foregone conclusions because they are directed. They are not undirected series of chaotic events that all align magically to result in the existence of you and me. They are directed or planned by this form of supernatural intelligence. And so those are the two alternatives I present to you.
Yeah, and I've had these conversations a lot of times. My take is that I understand why people would think that. It makes sense, and it could be that way. It certainly resolves a lot of the questions and the mystery to think that somebody planned it. It looks like when I look on cosmic history and our history, whenever I look at long periods of time, it looks like I see a lot of trial and error and a lot of hit and miss. So things trying to or appearing to try to work together and not working out, or if they do work out, it doesn't lead to anything. And then out of those attempts, some things do work out. And that makes me wonder if there's somebody that had a plan. Like 14 billion years ago, was there an agency that said, definitely God conclusion and definitely Faithiest Atheists are going to have this conversation on Sunday morning? And I think that's unlikely that an agency would have known that. So there's too much what I see as chaos. This is the quickest way to say it. There's too much chaos that I see for me to think that this was all planned out. But there's also so much order that I also think it's unlikely that everything was just all whoops. And now God conclusion and Faithiest Atheists are having this conversation. So if someone tries to say, no, it was all whoopses, then I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I see so much order. And then if someone says, no, God knew it 14 billion years ago exactly, then I would say, I don't know, there's so much chaos. I'm in between.
I think that's fair. We're getting into theological questions, which I guess is perfectly acceptable given my book title. But the question of predestination versus free will.
Oh, yeah.
Is God omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent? Does he know the past, present, and future?
Right.
And one chapter I read recently in the Bible really helped change my understanding of that problem.
Okay.
Because I'm not 100% sold that God knows a future that hasn't happened. Again, this is just like the concept of nothing.
Right.
There's the arrow of time where you and I experience time, and
Mhm.
time begins at one location and it goes in one direction. And you can't ever go back in the past. You can't unbreak an egg. But a being that exists outside of our space and time would, in theory, exist in past, present, and the potential future. But what the Bible passage that I read was 1 Samuel 23.
Okay.
And it was talking about David, and the Philistines were causing a lot of havoc in this place called Keilah.
Mhm.
And they were raiding the place and stealing grain from the threshing floors, that kind of thing. And David asked God, he said, I'm having a lot of problems with Saul right at the moment. Should I go down there and fight with the Philistines when I got all these problems here at home? And God said, yeah, go on down there and do it. I'm with you 100%. So David does go to Keilah. He does defeat the Philistines, but then Saul finds out about it, and Saul starts to marshal his forces, and he's going down to Keilah because Keilah is a walled city, and David will be trapped inside if Saul gets there before he gets out. And basically, he'll have him boxed in. He can lay siege to the city and eventually force the people to give David over. And David's going, well, I just saved the people of Keilah. They ought to owe me gratitude. Do I really need to go running off and hiding like a coward after I've just had this great victory over our national enemies? But the enemy within is coming after me now, and I need to know. So he asked God two questions. He says, do I need to leave Keilah? Is Saul going to come to Keilah if I stay here? And will the people of Keilah hand me over if Saul comes? And God says, if you stay here, Saul's going to come. And yeah, the people are going to hand you over. It's not going to go well for you. So David does a sensible thing. He leaves Keilah. Saul doesn't come down there. Problem resolved. But to me, the thing is, David didn't ask God to give him a guaranteed outcome. He asked God what the potential outcome would be. Right. And God didn't say, if you stay here, I will lay waste to Saul and smite him and the troops that he brings or anything like that. And he doesn't say that the people of Keilah will fight to the last man to defend you. He says, no, if you stay there, you're toast. So David does the prudent thing and he leaves. But modern people would say, well, David should have asked God to deliver him from Saul or do something other than asking God for guidance, which is the right thing to do, in my opinion. And it paid off for David.
Yeah, I think a lot of those questions are people thinking in terms of, I want to know for sure. I want to know. And if God has all these powers, then I want him to show me that. So they're thinking in terms of those absolutes. I think that's where a lot of those questions come from, or challenges. One thing I wanted to say about, even if you take God out of it and just like imagine like an alien from another dimension, and they're watching our universe and they can see us all, they can see the entire universe starting and fading away. They can see all that at once. And they're watching all of us in our time do all of our things. They're not forcing us to do that. They're just seeing that we're doing it. So like an alien, and I realize another dimension and another alien, I realize that's all pretend. But if that were to happen, then the alien is not forcing us to do it. We're still making our own decisions. It's just that the alien can see what all those decisions are before we even get there. So me at 10 years old, he can look at me at 10 and look at me at 60 and say, I know what you're going to know in 50 years, but he's not making me do that.
That's a good way of looking at it. That's a good point. And to me, free will is the second greatest gift that we get from God after the gift of life itself. So right. If we don't have free will, in essence, we're slaves to whatever our destiny is. Whereas if we have free will, if we can choose between good and evil, we can choose between right and wrong, then we have true freedom.
Yeah, I get that. I'm not sure how free will works. Like whether a creator gives it to us or whether we biologically have it. I don't know what the mechanism would be for how that would work. But I do agree that everyone perceives it. Everyone perceives like genuine conflict when they can look forward and they can see problems and challenges no matter what they do, and they can agonize over what they're going to do and even take a few steps towards one thing and say, no, I can't, because now I realize how bad this is going to be. So we definitely perceive that, whether that's free will or multiple biological compulsions fighting it out, and we don't know which one's worse. Whichever is the case, we definitely perceive something like free will. And something I mentioned in my podcast the other day with Braxton and Than was one of these books behind me. He makes the argument that it's definitely all determined and that we have no free will. But he says we still need to treat each other as if we do, and we still need to hold people accountable, even though it's not true, because that social pressure of knowing that you're going to be held accountable is another outside force that your mind will take into consideration. So that when you're thinking, should I go rob a bank? Even if there's some sort of biological compulsion to make you go rob a bank, now there's going to be the social pressure of knowing that you're going to get locked up and thrown in jail for 20 years to also add pressure to that, so that maybe that pressure determines for you to not rob the bank. So he's like, it's still something like free will, even though it's not technically true.
Who wrote that book?
This guy, Pascal Boyer. Where is it at? Oh, here. Check out this book, Minds
Minds Make Societies.
by Pascal Boyer. And he's saying there's no free will, but if society doesn't hold each other accountable anyway, even though there's not, then we're screwed. So we've got to hold each other accountable. And yeah, that sucks. But if we don't do it, then we're not going to have that social pressure added to our analysis. And then we really are going to be chaotic.
Well, I know that we've already had the moral argument, so to speak, in a previous podcast. So I don't want to rehash old arguments.
It was in your book. I believe you mentioned that in your book.
I have a chapter on the moral argument because to me, you don't have any justification for saying something is inherently good or inherently evil unless you have an objective standard.
Right.
And the old tried and true example is the Nazis who were legally able to murder the Jews. They were legally allowed, according to German laws, to commit the Holocaust. But the rest of the world looked at that in horror and said, that is not just wrong, it's evil. But if there is nothing that is objectively good, how do we know what is evil and what is good?
Yeah, and we did talk about that before on one of our podcasts, but since this is about your book, I can just remind people my take on this is that because I think so much of our history is trial and error, I think we became the kind of species that although we have a lot of selfish tendencies, we also have a tendency to think about the well-being of others. And there's probably some chemicals behind that. So maybe some chemicals push you to be selfish, but then some other chemicals push you to consider other people. And maybe after generations of atrocities, we're at the point now where we will look out for some things that are just so awful and so egregious that we're willing to step up. Maybe it is just chemicals, but
well, define the word atrocity for me.
Well, like you were saying for the Nazis, murdering a whole bunch of people, an entire culture. I think our history the human history is filled with those kind of things.
Well, and I would argue as the world becomes more secular and less religious, we've become much more tolerant of inexcusable behavior, and we've murdered millions and millions of unborn children for the sake of convenience.
Yeah, you've got the unborn children thing. I've actually got a few things to say about the unborn children and things like that. I think it also just depends on how you look at it, because as vitriolic and as hateful as you see all around the world, there's still some degree of humanity. There's still a whole bunch of people getting up in a street filled with people who believe differently and sending their kids to school together and watching out for one another and yelling at each other online, but then in real life helping each other out. There's some basic levels of humanity of just cooperation and just binding together that I think are chemically induced sometimes. But if we don't have that, then we won't be here. So for me, the justification is existing or not existing. And if you don't have some of that cooperation instilled within you, then you're not going to be here. So for me, that's justification.
Well, the problem is that people want to see things in a black and white way. And I started this conversation by trying to force a black and white scenario on you where the universe is either planned or it's unplanned, where I'm giving you a binary alternative. But when it comes to a subject like abortion, it gets complicated very quickly. And when third trimester abortions and infanticide, post-birth abortions, things like that, those to me are unconscionable. But when you get into the story of a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old girl who's raped by her mother's boyfriend, I don't know. I don't have all the answers to say, oh yeah, she's got to give birth to that child because she's still a child. It's not something that, again, you can just say there's a hard and fast rule that in every circumstance applies.
I agree.
But we have to look at things logically and common sense, apply common sense to the problems.
Yeah, and I think artificial intelligence technology is about to take the pro-life question to a whole nother realm. Maybe even in years I think we're about the same age. I think even in our lifetime, we're going to see it where companies you can order babies. A couple can order a baby and go to a company, and they'll not just have your DNA, but maybe Brad Pitt's DNA, maybe some super genius's DNA in there too. And you can order the baby, and you'll have, maybe they'll artificially create 1,000 embryos and then do tests on them and say, okay, out of these 1,000, these 3 look like they're the best, and then those other 900 just get eliminated. I think when it gets to that point, and we're nowhere near that now, but when we get to that point, then I think pro-life is going to have
it may actually be closer than you think. I recently read a story about a gay couple who hired this woman to be the surrogate mother of their child, and she got impregnated and developed cancer during the pregnancy, and said that she wanted to deliver the baby early because then she needed to get started with her cancer treatment. And the gay couple said the child needs to die. They said you can't. They said we will not cancel the contract and allow you to give birth to this child. We will not provide care if the child is born prematurely, which it was, and it died from neglect. And that's where we are now.
Right.
When you're talking about designer babies down the road and seeing the Barbie movies and that kind of stuff, I think that we may see the end of times in our lifetime. Before we see.
You might not know, if you think about it, there's probably in the 1700s, there was probably 1,000 times a day where a girl would go off in the woods and have a baby and come home. Where were you? I went to go to the town or whatever. So I think
I'm sure it happened, but I don't know if it happened that often. It's difficult to hide a pregnancy unless you're morbidly obese already.
Yeah, I'm just saying, I think there's been atrocities throughout history, but what we have now is we have social media and cameras, and we have an outraged audience waiting to hear it. So now anything that happens, we grab it and spread it around. So what we have now is just attention. We can't hide it anymore.
But you said that you feel like people are inherently good, but that doesn't make news.
No, well, I think we're inherently conflicted. I think we're conflicted between selfishness and then cooperation for others, and then upholding some ideals. The ideology is a huge part of humanity too, is having some sort of ideals that you think are really important. So I think the conflict between our ideologies and then cooperating with other people and then our own self-interest are 3 kind of forces that just battle it out inside of us. It doesn't necessarily make for good people, but leaves some degree of humanity.
Well, the guy, I think his name is Daniel Perry, the one who was in New York, former Marine, I think he was. The guy was threatening the other subway commuters and he subdued them. And a generation ago, he would have been treated as a hero.
Yep.
And now he's facing, I think, manslaughter or murder charges.
Yeah, I've heard about things like that. Yeah, we're definitely in a weird spot, and we're going to have stories like this that happen a lot. But I don't think that means end times. Of course, I'm a non-believer, so I don't think end times. If there's going to be an end times, it's going to be like some sort of cosmic thing or the weather. We're not going to be able to figure out. Although we're so brilliant that I think that even if something disastrous were to happen, there's probably going to be a small select people that figure something out. They might not last long, but we're pretty rigorous. I think our end times will be something like that, not some sort of cosmic or supernatural force coming down and saying, okay, test is over. Now let's move on to eternity. I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, there's the popular end of time scenario, which is global climate change. It's going to melt the polar caps and that all that good nonsense. And I don't believe in that conspiracy theory. But because I do read a lot of science, there are other conspiracy theories that I go, well, I don't know if that's true, but if it does, we are so screwed. The one that is got my attention recently has been the reversal of the polar ice caps, where the North Pole's supposed to become the South Pole and the South Pole. They're supposed to reverse. That's supposed to just wreak total chaos.
Right.
and probably destroy most of the livable land where we currently reside. And
Yeah, there's problems like that where I'm like, I don't know how to prepare or think about that. I agree that there's probably some things coming that we can't handle or we won't handle very well. And the way I get through the day is I'm like, hey, today is Sunday. I've got to make sure my kids have lunch in an hour. My kids want to go see a movie at 2. So I just stay.
what do they want to go see?
They want to go see Oppenheimer.
Really?
Yeah.
I was afraid you were going to say Barbie.
My oldest went to go see it. This was funny because all last week people were talking about, we've jumped topics so often, but it's entertaining. But all last week people were arguing over that Jason Aldean country song and Barbie.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my daughter got invited. They're both teenage girls, so of course they get invited everywhere. But she got invited to go see Barbie, and she was like, "It's okay." And she was watching it with people who are like, "We're honor bound to watch this movie upholding women," and she was like, "Oh, okay," and it was fine. And then I listened to that country song. I was born in Georgia, and I live in Arizona. I like country music, and it's okay. But the narratives are, it's the most wonderful God given thing ever, or it is the worst, sickening, most horrific thing ever. And in each case, it was like, yeah.
And nobody likes both.
I'm like, so we both experienced that. I experienced a country song, and she experienced Barbie, and we're like, yeah, it's okay. We don't hate it, don't love it. It's a thing. Although I did like Sound of Freedom as much as I'm not Christian, I thought it was a good movie. It was like Rambo. Sound of Freedom was just like a Rambo movie. I thought it was very well done.
Well, several years before that movie was ever announced, I went to a conference here in Georgia that
Mm-hmm.
had the state attorney general and some other people, and they were talking about child trafficking in Georgia, and it opened my eyes because I would have never guessed that Georgia had the problem it's got with child trafficking. It's huge, and it's billions of dollars.
Right, and thousands. I think a National Center for Missing and Exploited Children says 20,000 cases per year, and I forget how it breaks down. Man, it might even be that many thousand per state. I forget, but it's an unreal amount number of people. And the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is a government agency. It's not it's not ideological. It's just going by the numbers.
And that's an evil that I truly cannot comprehend. Hurting an innocent person is bad enough, but a child.
And then making a business out of it, to have such an appetite that people are like, oh, people like this, I'm going to streamline this and organize it. It's a weirdness that I can't fathom.
Yeah, it's horrible. Well, the other evidence that we haven't talked about, I see that we're already at close to an hour, and there's a whole nother big segment of evidence, the supernatural scientific evidence.
And we broached this a little bit in one of our talks, but we should do it again because it's also part of your book. In fact, you have at least one good story about supernatural experiences in your book.
Which was Pam Reynolds?
Was it the house? Like you were.
Oh, you're talking about my personal story. See, I don't even count that as evidence. Although I did start to think about it, the guy that was there with me, he is a scientist and he was a corroborating witness. It's an anecdote that kind of borderline empirical evidence, perhaps, but I wouldn't debate or argue that point because there was so much better evidence, in my opinion,
Okay.
that the mind and the brain are separable entities. And I will use the near death experience quite a bit. And I'm preparing for an interview that I'm going to be doing next month with a professor named Steve Miller, who is a philosophy professor at Kennesaw State University here in Georgia. And he wrote a book about the near death experience, but he also wrote a book about deathbed experiences. And it there is a tremendous body of evidence that is virtually ignored or neglected or unknown. But there are books that from date back from the 1920s. This book, and I can't remember the guy's name, is Flammarion, I think. Camille Flammarion was his name, but he was a very well respected doctor, and he had hundreds of these accounts where people would be dying and say, "Oh, I see my sister Vida," and did not know that Vida had died 3 weeks earlier.
I see
And,
what you
and so it was any one of those accounts would be considered insufficient, I would think. But
right.
it's presented as a volume, as a body of evidence with hundreds of these accounts. And they are from credible sources.
Right. Yeah, I've never had one, but there's enough weirdness in the world that I would say it could be that way. That there's some sort of connectedness or awareness that goes beyond the senses that we're aware of, and if so, that pushes naturalism as we understand it off the table. I just don't understand it. Always, if I hear stories like that, I'm like, wow, that's amazing. Especially if it's a good news story, or if it gives somebody comfort, then I just support that it happened. But I can't explain it, and I'll concede that there's weird stuff like that that maybe somebody wants to say, no, I'm going to explain exactly what happens, and I don't think they'll be able to.
Well,
Again,
you say that you look the feel good stories, the positive stories, and I'm just the opposite.
oh,
When
you
I
are
look at the near death experience, I can see how that could be argued that it's just a pleasant hallucination
right,
produced by chemical reactions in the dying brain when you
right,
set aside the corroborated veridical evidence that's a subset of the experience. But
right,
when you add in what I call the negative NDEs, where the people claim that they died and went to hell and
right,
were rescued from hell by God,
right.
then
That's not comfortable.
that to me, because they are almost always former atheists, almost invariably. One guy that I talked to that said he went to hell was, I would say, more of a capitalist or materialist than an atheist per se, but he wasn't a person of faith. He had a childhood faith, but once he'd gotten to adulthood, he completely lost sight of that, gets shot in the back of the head, and then goes to hell. And that was my take on it was, you're the innocent bystander. You're not there in a drug deal. You're minding your own business, waiting on a cab, and somebody shoots you in the back of the head and you're dead. Why do you think you went to hell? And he said, because I deserved it. And I don't want to argue or belabor the point, but it's a pretty compelling argument that he's making.
It is not comfortable. It's an uncomfortable story. So you're right. That's a good point. That it wasn't something that made him comfortable. It's something that devastated him.
And another thing that I like to make the point of is when you talk about a near death experience, and you had said something earlier about that you never had one, and I haven't either. And fortunately, we've also never had the deathbed experiences, because then we wouldn't be here talking to each other. But
If we were, that would be evidence.
yeah, it would be miraculous evidence indeed. But what I like to say about the near death experience is, take the visions of heaven, visions of hell out of the equation completely. Look at the evidence, meaning, did the person really suffer some significant trauma? Point number one. Point number two, have their lives changed dramatically one way or another as a result of nearly dying? And what I've discovered is that people that have the near death experience, they tend to fear death much less than the average person, and they tend to volunteer much more over than the average person. Most of them focusing their time in hospice care, helping people transition from life to death.
They see themselves as gatekeepers because they were there. I like that.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I like that.
And it's remarkable because, again, you get one story and it's a great story. Pam Reynolds on the operating table, all the blood drained from her head, and she hears a conversation she's not supposed to hear, sees things and describes them accurately that she could not have possibly seen with her physical eyes because there was never the opportunity. And that's a great story. But it she did have, I think, one example of corroborated veridical information that she offered, but I can't remember what it was. But then there are all these other examples of people. Mary Neal is another good example. She's an orthopedic surgeon, science minded individual. What went to church, but was not devoutly religious prior to having a canoeing accident or rafting accident in a canoe down in Chile, I think it was, and she drowned and suffered a tremendous difficulties. But when she came back, she said that she knew that her son was going to die, that she had been told this
I see.
prior to her son's death.
Okay.
And that to me, now that the son is dead, you can make any kind of claims that you want. But to make that, I don't know if I'm going to word this properly. I give that example a lot of credibility because of her scientific background, because of her naturally skeptical nature, and
Yeah.
because of her sincerity when she offers her story as a testimony. When
Yeah.
she gets up in churches and stuff like that. I don't know if she's written a book to describe her experiences in detail. I would think if she had, it would have been a bestseller, kind of like Eben Alexander's book, because her story is truly remarkable. But I didn't know about it for the longest time. I just found out about it about a year ago. But the point is, I think the point is that there are things that happen that cannot be explained that seem to take a particular direction. They seem to point to one potential answer as being logical, and that is that the mind and the brain are not the same thing. The brain itself is just physical tissue, but the mind is something that probably exists after the brain is no longer functioning and dead.
I do believe that the mind and consciousness is like the result of activity. And for me, I think you need your brain for that to happen. But I think there's more going on than just the brain. And you're right, naturalists aren't great at explaining how that works.
Yeah, I think that we might actually have to change your name to the Faithiest Spiritualist because you're walking that tightrope between atheism and some sort of spiritual acknowledgement.
Right.
And
Well, for me, it's like I don't know, and for me, saying no is that could include all kinds of things. I've even had another apologist named Kurt Jaros who says that technically you're a deist. If you map it all out, you're not even not an atheist, and you're not even agnostic. You're actually more of a deist than you are agnostic. That's great. For me, I'm like, I don't know. It's a big mystery, and it could be this other thing. Like, if I were to find out that there was some agent in charge, and I were to meet that agent, and that were to convince me, that wouldn't really freak me out. I don't want to say I would shrug it off, but I would say, well, that explains some of the mysteries. I get that. I would still probably have a lot of questions. And if I was having a conversation, I would have a list of questions like, hey, are we supposed to take this Bible seriously? And is there something going on in this? I'd have some serious questions. But in terms of like finding out that there is some sort of mind, that wouldn't really freak me out. I think all of our religions are of human origin, but I agree that we're in a world of mysteries, and our existence still contains a lot of mysteries. That's the reason why they let me into the atheist club on Wednesdays, which is when we have our meetings. Is that I think that religions are of human origin. So in some cases, they'll say, okay, that's good enough. You can't go to the back room, but you can come in and sit down in front.
good enough.
Yeah.
And I tend to agree more than we disagree. I think that there is an element of man involved in the Bible. It's difficult to dispute. But my difference, I think, than from you is I believe that the humans were divinely inspired by this supernatural intelligence. And
Right.
some of what was communicated was obtuse and confusing that it's difficult to say what was meant
Right.
by this one verse or this one chapter.
Yeah.
But there definitely seems to be an element of supernatural wisdom. And I've heard more than one scientist say that if you start with the first book of Genesis and read the account, it maps to the scientific evidence.
That's probably Hugh Ross. Hugh Ross is good on with that.
Hugh Ross is only one of many who have made that point. But yes, Hugh Ross is another one that I read early in my journey from apathetic agnosticism to where I am today.
Right.
I think his was the very first book I wrote. I read The Creator and the Cosmos.
Yeah, that's part of his ministry is that he started with, he got every religious book and just started on page one and kept going until he found one that was like, wait a minute, hold on, this is actually what happened. And then just kept reading it and said, okay, this is the one that actually matches science. Now, I don't know if that's literally what really happened to him, but that's his testimony is that start with page one, keep going. If it doesn't match science, put it down and get the next book. And got to the Bible and that matched.
Yeah, he's a good guy.
He's smart dude. He and Stephen Meyer are among my favorite. If I have a science question or a gotcha question that gets into science, I'll usually try to send them an email or a message to see what their take is on it.
And you hear back from them.
Or somebody from there. I very rarely, as I've met a lot of apologists and talked to them and stuff.
But, yeah.
But usually when I contact a ministry, somebody on staff will respond.
Yeah, I found staff responds to me sometimes too when I'm reaching out trying to get podcasts arranged. But
it's a tough business. Well, they're popular people.
They are. I'm trying to get Gary Habermas on the show one of these days.
Yeah, he started all this, honestly.
He's brilliant.
Back in the 80s, people, you and I know, but back in the 80s, he and Norm Geisler and WLC was just getting started. But like J.P. Moreland, this was a thing. This was going on in the 80s. Josh McDowell.
Josh McDowell's another one that I've read.
Yeah, they weren't huge, big names in the 80s. They were to a degree, but there wasn't like apologetics ministry like there is now. I think Frank Turek is the one who got that mainstream in the early 2000s.
I don't know why I'm so fixated on your name that I want to change it because it's a great name. It really is.
Get that a whole lot. And for me,
I want to expand on it because you are open-minded, where the vast majority of people that you talk with, when they come in, they've got a preset idea. And then no matter what you say, no matter how you say it, it's not going to dent what they're hearing. And I find that you're the person that I can talk to and find that you respond appropriately.
And they'll get mad. Even if you have somebody from the Flat Earth Society on your show, if you have pictures and video, and if they can't produce any pictures of the edge of the earth, they just get mad. It's not about evidence. They'll talk to you about evidence and facts and truth, but really you're just making them mad because you're cornering them.
Well, I try not to be hard and fast. And when it comes to the flat earth, I understand that there are references in the Bible that allow people to come to the conclusion that the earth might possibly be flat, and all of the space missions and moonshots and all these different things that have happened over the last 50 years were all staged Hollywood productions. I'm not nearly that big of a conspiracy theorist, but there are people that do gravitate toward that mentality.
And for them, you're just going to have, if you try to show them evidence or talk about evidence, you're just going to make them angry. So you're right.
What I do is I say, just to answer me one quick question. I have been to Australia. I've flown there. I've spent time there. I spent like 6 months. I know that when it's daylight in the United States, it's nighttime there. Right. I know that the sky at night is different. Right. There's the Southern Cross in the night sky there, whereas we have the Big Dipper. Yeah. How is that possible if the earth is flat and both Australia and North America are on the same side? And if it's a coin, when did I fly and cross that boundary? And why didn't the pilot call it to my attention on the 15-hour flight from LA to Sydney?
Yeah, I agree. I've heard all kinds of, I've heard that Australia and the US are actually on the same plane. It's just they're so far away and the sun is so close to the earth that when the sun's over in America, it's just so far away that you can't see it in Australia. And you're looking at different stars because you're so far away. I've heard all kinds. My thing with flat Earth now is like, take me to the edge, take me to the nearest edge from here, and let's go look at it, or show me a picture of the edge.
Well,
And that's
when I post things that I think of as a joke, a
yeah,
clear joke, the flat Earth surfing championships where you got guys going off the edge,
yeah,
it's just a joke. But people, like you said, they get mad and they argue. And some of these people are friends of mine. They're people that I know on the personal Facebook page. They're Christians that I've known for a long time. And I just know that they have this one idea. I don't even want to say it's wacky. It's just completely different than mine. And when I ask them to explain where something as big as a continent, and I get no response other than the earth is flat, I don't know how to process that conversation further than that.
yeah. And I get there a lot, and I'll say something like, "Okay, I see that that's where you are," and I'll let it go there. A lot of times they want me to say, "Live your truth," so that then they can say, "Aha, you don't think truth exists." And so that's a whole other thing I try to avoid. But I am saying, if you're going to believe that's the truth, then go ahead and believe that's the truth.
Well, I'm going to steal something from that I saw from William Lane Craig to wrap up our conversation for
Okay.
today, because I think we're pretty much done. We've talked about existential scientific evidence and supernatural scientific evidence and the
Morality.
the morality argument and all that stuff. So I think that we've covered most of the book. We don't need to bash Dawkins anymore. But William Lane Craig was talking with a guy named Keith Parsons, and
Uh-huh.
Keith Parsons is an atheist,
Okay.
and so they're having this debate. And William Lane Craig was saying to Keith Parsons that you're telling me that there's not enough evidence for you to believe in God, and what I'm hearing is there is no amount of evidence that you would believe. And Keith Parsons said, "Oh, that's not true. Tomorrow morning, if I got up and went out to get my paper,
I saw that.
you see the thing, and God says, Keith Parsons, stop logic chopping me." And he said, and William Lane Craig does the punchline of, "Well, you just say you're having a hallucination." No, that is not the answer I would get from you.
Yeah, I would believe it. I would trust my senses. If I met God or had something like that, then I would say, okay, I now see it and I trust my senses and I'm going to go with it. The only thing I would do differently than maybe some prophets is that I would not go forth and tell the world expecting them to convince. I wouldn't expect to change the world with religion because I know how people are. Like, even if I met God and he explained everything to me, even the Bible verses and even how heaven and hell works, and he lets me write it down, as I was leaving him, and he would be like, "Now go clear this up." As I was leaving him, I would say, "You realize how people are, right? I'm going to have a hard time with this." And other people are going to say I'm delusional. And I wouldn't expect myself to change the world. I would just say, okay, I'm convinced and I'm happy with that. And I'll tell other people because I can't help it, but I wouldn't expect to everybody stop what they were doing and suddenly believe what I said. I would understand that from their perspective, they didn't have the experiences that I just had. So I would understand that I'm not going to be 100% successful with that.
Well, you said earlier that your big hangup is with man-made religions.
Right.
That
Something
you
about,
say all religions are man-made,
yeah.
but you are not completely ruling out the possibility of a supernatural realm, just not one that's described by contemporary religions.
Yeah, there could be some sort of agent that's watching us. There could be an agent that's messing with us. I once had Josh Rasmussen say, okay, let's say that these aliens from another dimension came and confirmed with you that some form of theism is true. And they want to know, now that you know that, what kind of qualities do they have? And then I said, okay, it would be something like the Greek pantheon where there's multiple gods with multiple agendas. And this guy goes down here and reveals something. And this lady goes down here and reveals something. And that's why we have different expectations and different understandings. I said, it's either that or it's a deity who is messing with us. Like, he's like, hey guys, watch this. I'm going to tell them this. I'm going to wait a couple thousand years, then I'm going to tell them this. And then I'm just going to watch them fight it out because they're my creation and I can do what I want.
You said something. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting. Go ahead.
I'm just saying, those, if I was told for sure that theism was true and I had to guess what those forms of theism was, it would be something like a bunch of gods with different agendas, or one God that's deliberately messing with us because he just wants to.
Well, what I was going to say a second ago was you had said that extraterrestrials are aliens, but you used a very important distinction. You said from another dimension.
Yeah,
Because what I've always argued is when somebody says, well, God could just be an extraterrestrial would be within our created universe.
you still be.
But from another dimension, what I'm calling God, you can call an alien
Yeah,
because it's a supernatural form of intelligence, meaning it's
yeah,
not a primary resident of this particular dimension.
yeah. I've often said, what if we were like all part of an experiment? In which case, we're on a petri dish in some cosmic university, and the aliens are watching us and like, oh look, they're going to war. Oh look, these guys are having a picnic. So that's still an intelligent mind intervening. So that's close enough.
You got to make me one promise. No matter how many more podcasts we do together, we're
Yeah,
not
sure.
ever starting a new religion.
Oh, well, let's see. I actually think we're doing that now. I think the world is creating either a new religion or new forms of Christianity that you won't recognize probably soon, probably sooner than you'll be comfortable with. So I think that's coming.
I wouldn't disagree with that because I've already learned from what I know about the Dead Sea Scrolls that some of what's in the Bible has been challenged by some of what's in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah.
And people say, well, the Bible is the inerrant word of God. And I'm going, well, we don't know one way or another. I personally believe in the Bible, but that's not the same thing as saying I know everything in it is absolutely true. That takes an element of faith.
Well, and plus the Bible is about to be eventually, and maybe again within just the next few years, nobody's going to have the book. They're going to have it online. And once it's online, the Bible can say, and then a guy named Bob came in with his iPhone, and Moses was like, "What's that?" And Bob said, "This is an iPhone." That could be in the Bible in just a few years. And if 10 million people download it, then there's your Bible.
I have to think about that because I don't think that we'll ever get to the point where there are Book of Eli, there are no Bibles in the world. I do believe that it's becoming a more problematic online resource. And I say that because of what the Chinese are trying to do with the Bible. I don't know if you've heard this. They're trying to rewrite it.
Well, and I think a lot of people are. I think the Chinese are just really organized. I don't think we're going to be a world without Bibles. I think we're going to be a world complete. Everybody has a Bible, but my Bible is going to have iPhones, and someone else's Bible is going to have the Barbie movie, and it's all going to. This goes back 2,000 years, and yet they knew about iPhones. We're just going to have our own Bibles, and yet what China's done is they've realized that once enough people believe something, you can work wonders with that. So China's on top of trying to control that propaganda and have China in Scripture, so that when they take over the world in their minds, they'll say, as the Bible has foretold, we're now in charge. And
it's not my understanding that they had included China in Scripture. It was that they had changed Jesus, for example, in the story of the adulterous woman, where he tells he without sin cast the first stone.
The woman
In the Chinese version, Jesus stones her to death.
Ah, I see. Okay, because they're going after adultery. I just think that they're going to keep going with that. I think I'm jumping ahead because I have this really, one of my biggest messages is that if you have any group of people who are unchecked by authority, that they can do whatever they want, then I just say once they have that, they'll start saying they speak for God. They'll change it'll be a lot like Animal Farm. They'll just say, what we think this week is the ultimate truth. And if you challenge that and you don't obey immediately, then you're the problem. I'm always pushing. That's, even if people are Christians, that's going to happen. If there's not some other power that can tell them to shut up and they're being ridiculous, then we're going to have to face that kind of stuff.
I agree. Well, once again, Richard, I feel like we've had a great conversation, and I don't feel like I won anything. I feel like maybe I treaded water a little bit, but
you did good, and I'm glad we got to talk because you sent me your book and we had promised we'd talk about it. And there's other things we can talk about. In my line of work, I study about why people get so angry and so fixated on one or two things and why they fight for it, even when you're joking. Like people who get that fixated, they hate jokes because in their mind, you can't toy with the thing that they're fixated on. So I can, if we ever want to do a show about why people get like that, I know a lot about that.
Well, there's a lot about my religion that I don't know myself. I was one guy that I really admire is Vodi Bakum.
Oh, I never heard of him.
He's an evangelist. I've seen a lot of YouTube clips of him. And recently, he's like on point 9 times out of 10. And recently, he said something about to the effect of he doesn't believe in having any pictures of Jesus because of the graven images commandment.
I have heard of that. I haven't heard of him, but I've heard of that.
Yeah. And I'm not sure how I feel about that argument because to me, there's a lot of great artwork that depicts Jesus, and some of it is based on the Shroud of Turin, which I think is scientific evidence that somebody who may or may not have been Jesus was crucified about the same time that Jesus was allegedly crucified. And the body matches remarkably. The evidence on the shroud matches the biblical account remarkably.
I've heard about that. I've heard about research on the kind of injuries that he had and how that matches scripture. I've heard that.
And I mean, I've seen this program on the History Channel, I think it was, on the real face of Jesus, it was called. And this guy who specializes in making death masks made a cast image based on a 3D mapping of the shroud. And it was incredible. And what was even more amazing was it matched really closely to a painting this other girl had done named Ariadne Myrick, I think is her name. Again, it's all of these different points of evidence that seem to be converging. There's somebody that's like a Richard Dawkins, no matter how, or Keith Parsons, no matter how much evidence that you put in front of them, they're not going to accept it. But then there are the people like you that go, I don't know what to make about that, but I'm going to think about it for a while.
I try to do that. I do try to do that.
That's all we can hope for.
And I do think the graven images, I think the reason why they got put in the Bible was that sometimes people would, in good faith, they would make an image to help them feel comfortable, but then that image would take over and their thoughts alone with that thing would take them away from what the priests had in mind. And so I think that's where the rule, this is just Richard's take, but I think that's the thing against graven images was that the image itself might become too important.
Yeah, it can. And God the Father is spirit. So there isn't anything that you can present that is an accurate depiction of Yahweh. But Jesus was a human being and Jesus had a likeness. And so I'm not sure that it's sacrilegious or violating one of the commandments to try to show that accurately.
Well, it's no matter what you believe, no matter what you believe or you don't believe, you're going to insult somebody. Somebody's going to be, you could be the fiercest.
And with somebody like that I respect a lot, like Vodi Bakum says, hey, that's a graven image. That gives me pause. That's my turn to say, maybe I need to think about it for a while.
That's exactly what I do. I try to think like, if I was the bad guy, what would I say? And how can I not be the bad guy? So I do a lot of that. I do a lot of what you do.
You are a good friend.
Thank
I
you.
enjoy our conversations.
Thank
and
you.
I look forward to the next one already.
Yeah, let's do it again.
All right, my friend. Well, I think that's enough for today. We're at an hour and a half. So, yeah.
We did good.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to The God Conclusion. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing to this channel. Join us again next week as we continue to seek truth. Quid est veritas.